The ice crackles beneath their feet. Two figures sprint through the moonlit forest, a woman and a massive mountain gorilla running side by side like ancient allies. Behind them, the angry shouts of armed hunters echo through the trees. The woman stumbles, falls hard against the frozen ground. The gorilla stops, turns back, and for a moment that defies everything we think we know about wild animals, extends a massive hand to help her up. This is not a fairy tale. This is not fiction. This happened in the remote mountains of Central Africa, where a single decision changed two lives forever. The woman's name is Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist who chose isolation over the chaos of civilization. The gorilla, she would come to call her Bantu, a name that means people in several African languages. What you're about to witness is the story of how a moment of impossible trust between two species created a bond that would challenge everything science thought. It knew about animal behavior, but this story doesn't start with that midnight chase through frozen wilderness. It doesn't begin with trust or friendship or any of the warm feelings you might expect. No, this story starts with blood, terror, and a choice that could have ended in death. To understand how a 400-pound silverback gorilla came to risk everything to save a human being, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a night when the temperature dropped below freezing in the Virunga Mountains, when a wounded beast appeared at Sarah's door, and when one woman's decision to open that door would set in motion events that would shock the scientific community and redefine what we know about the emotional intelligence of our closest genetic relatives. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need you to do something for me. Drop your country in the comments below and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because stories like this, real stories about the extraordinary connections that exist in our natural world, these are the stories that matter. These are the stories that remind us what it means to be human. And if you're here for that, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Now let's go back to where it all began. Dr. Sarah Chen never planned to live alone in the mountains. At 34, she had already built a reputation as one of the world's leading primatologists, with a PhD from Oxford and research published in every major scientific journal. She had offers from prestigious universities, consulting contracts with wildlife organizations, and a comfortable life waiting for her in London or New York or anywhere she chose to plant her flag. But Sarah chose none of those things. Instead, she chose a different path, one that led her to a small research station in the Virunga Mountains, where the borders of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo converge. Here, in one of the most remote and dangerous regions on Earth, she built herself a life of solitude and purpose. Her research station wasn't much to look at. A simple wooden cabin, maybe 800 square feet, with solar panels on the roof and a small generator for backup power. Inside, the walls were lined with bookshelves, research equipment, and months' worth of canned food. It was Spartan but functional. Everything she needed and nothing she didn't. Sarah had come here to study the mountain gorillas in their natural habitat, but more than that, she had come here to escape. 2 years earlier, her research partner and fiancé, Dr. Michael Rivera, had been killed in a climbing accident while conducting fieldwork in the Andes. The scientific community mourned the loss of a brilliant mind. But for Sarah, it was the end of everything she thought her life would be. The mountains became her sanctuary. Here, surrounded by some of the last remaining mountain gorillas on Earth, she could lose herself in her work. She spent her days tracking family groups, documenting behavior patterns, and contributing to conservation efforts that were literally fighting to save these magnificent creatures from extinction. But the mountains were also unforgiving. This was Hutu-Tutsi territory, where decades of conflict had left the land scarred and dangerous. Armed groups still moved through these forests. Poachers hunted the very animals Sarah was trying to protect. And the weather, especially in the wet season, could turn deadly without warning. Sarah knew the risks. She had prepared for them. What she hadn't prepared for was how the isolation would change her, how the silence of the forest would amplify the grief she thought she had left behind. How the absence of human connection would make her question everything about who she was and why she was there. She told herself she was doing important work. She told herself the world needed her research. She told herself that choosing solitude was a form of strength. But deep down, in the quiet moments between sunset and sleep, Sarah Chen was a woman running from pain, hiding in the mountains because it hurt less than facing the world she had left behind. She had no way of knowing that on one freezing night in March, the very isolation she had chosen would bring her face to face with a creature whose pain mirrored her own. A creature who would force her to choose between safety and compassion, between fear and love, between the person she had become and the person she was meant to be. March 15th started like any other day in the Virunga Mountains. Sarah woke before dawn, made her coffee and checked her equipment. The weather reports had been concerning. An unusual cold front was moving in from the north, bringing temperatures that could drop below freezing at their elevation. For Sarah, this meant staying close to the cabin and keeping the fire burning. But for the mountain gorillas she studied, cold weather meant something else entirely. It meant vulnerability. Mountain gorillas, despite their impressive size and strength, are surprisingly sensitive to temperature changes. Their thick fur can keep them warm in normal mountain weather. But when temperatures drop to near freezing levels, even these powerful animals struggled to survive. Sarah spent the day monitoring radio chatter from other research stations and conservation groups in the area. There were reports of unusual animal behavior, gorillas moving to lower elevations, family groups breaking apart as they searched for shelter. But there was something else in those reports, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Poachers, a group of armed hunters, had been spotted in the northern sector, the same area where Sarah had documented a family group just days before. These weren't subsistence hunters looking for food. These were commercial poachers, the kind who killed adult gorillas to capture babies for illegal sale, or who butchered entire families for their hands and heads, grotesque trophies that could fetch thousands of dollars on the black market. Sarah knew she should report the sighting to the park rangers, but communication in this remote area was spotty at best. Her satellite phone had been acting up for weeks, and the nearest ranger station was a 2-day hike through dangerous terrain. All she could do was hope that the gorillas in her study area would stay hidden until the threat passed. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop rapidly. By sunset, Sarah could see her breath inside the cabin. She built up the fire in her wood-burning stove and settled in for what she knew would be a long, cold night. But at 11:47 p.m., everything changed. Sarah was jolted awake by a sound she had never heard before, a low, rhythmic thumping against her cabin door. At first, she thought it might be wind blowing debris against the wood. But as she lay in her bed, listening carefully, she realized the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful to be random. Something was knocking on her door. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. In 2 years of living alone in these mountains, she had developed protocols for every conceivable threat. Armed poachers, dangerous wildlife, severe weather. She had plans for all of it. But those plans had never included something knocking on her door in the middle of the night. She slipped out of bed and moved quietly to the window. The night was dark, with heavy clouds blocking most of the moonlight. The knocking continued, patient, persistent, almost polite. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to break down the door. It was asking for entry. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and her rifle, a .30-06 that she kept loaded but had never fired outside of target practice. Her hands were shaking from cold or fear or both. She approached the door cautiously, listening for any other sounds that might give her a clue about what she was facing. The knocking stopped. For several long minutes, Sarah stood frozen by the door, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to wait until morning, to let whatever was out there move on. But another part of her, the scientist, the part that had always been driven by curiosity, needed to know what was out there. She took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and slowly pulled it open. What she saw defied every expectation, every fear, every scenario she had imagined. There, Sitting in the snow just a few feet from her doorstep was a mountain gorilla unlike any she had ever encountered. It was a female, massive even by silverback standards, with distinctive silver markings around her face that indicated advanced age. But it was her eyes that stopped Sarah cold. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal driven by instinct. They were eyes filled with intelligence, pain, and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. The gorilla was injured. Sarah could see dark stains in the snow around her, blood from what looked like a deep wound on her left shoulder. Her breathing was labored, creating small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. She was trembling, not from aggression or fear, but from cold and exhaustion, and she was looking directly at Sarah with an expression that seemed to say, "Please, help me." For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 years. Woman and gorilla stared at each other across the threshold. Everything Sarah knew about wildlife safety screamed at her to close the door immediately. Mountain gorillas, despite their generally peaceful nature, are still wild animals capable of incredible violence. An adult female can weigh over 300 pounds and possess strength 10 times that of a human being. Even if this gorilla appeared docile now, pain and stress could change that in an instant. But Sarah Chen had spent the last 2 years studying these creatures. She had observed their complex social structures, their emotional intelligence, their capacity for what could only be described as empathy. She had watched mothers comfort injured offspring, seen family members share food with the weak, witnessed acts of what appeared to be genuine altruism between gorillas who weren't even related. And now, looking into the eyes of this wounded female, Sarah saw something she recognized, the same desperate loneliness that had driven her to these mountains. In the first place, the decision she made next would haunt her for weeks and change her life forever. "Okay," she whispered, stepping back from the door. "Okay, come in." The gorilla didn't move immediately. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to process Sarah's words. Then slowly and carefully she began to rise to her feet. The movement obviously caused her pain. Sarah could hear a low grunt of discomfort, but the gorilla managed to stand and take a tentative step toward the door. Sarah backed further into the cabin, her rifle still in her hands, but pointed toward the floor. The gorilla paused at the threshold, her massive frame filling the doorway completely. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she would even fit through the opening. Then, with surprising grace for an animal of her size, the gorilla lowered herself and squeezed through the door. Once inside, the gorilla immediately moved away from Sarah, settling into a corner of the main room with her back against the wall. It was a defensive position, but not an aggressive one. She was making herself as non-threatening as possible, while still maintaining a sense of security. Sarah closed the door and locked it, her mind racing. She had just allowed a 300-pound wild gorilla into her living space. If anyone from the research community could see her now, her career would be over. More importantly, if this went wrong, if the gorilla became aggressive or panicked, Sarah could be dead within minutes. But as she looked at her unexpected guest, those concerns faded into the background. The gorilla was in obvious distress. Her breathing was still labored, and the wound on her shoulder was worse than Sarah had initially thought. It was a clean cut, too precise to be from a fall or a fight with another animal. This was a knife wound or possibly a machete, which meant human involvement. Poachers. Sarah set her rifle aside and knelt down about 10 feet from the gorilla. "Let me see," she said softly, knowing the gorilla couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone would communicate her intentions. The gorilla watched Sarah carefully, but didn't retreat. Slowly, Sarah began to move closer, her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. When she was about 6 feet away, she stopped and held out her hand, palm up, a gesture of peace that she hoped would translate across species. The gorilla's response surprised her. Instead of shrinking back or showing signs of aggression, she extended her own massive hand toward Sarah's. They didn't touch, both remained cautious. But the gesture was clear: communication, trust, beginning of something unprecedented. "I'm going to call you Bantu," Sarah whispered, remembering the African word that meant people. "Is that okay with you?" Bantu, for that's how Sarah would think of her from this moment forward, seemed to relax slightly at the sound of Sarah's voice. Her breathing became more regular, though she was still obviously in pain. Sarah knew she needed to treat the wound, but she also knew that approaching an injured wild animal was incredibly dangerous. She moved slowly to her medical kit and began gathering supplies: antiseptic, bandages, pain medication that she hoped would be safe for a gorilla. All the while she talked softly, narrating her actions, trying to maintain the fragile connection they had established. "I'm going to help you," she said, returning with her supplies. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but we're going to figure this out together," as Sarah cleaned and dressed Bantu's wound, a process that took nearly an hour and required incredible patience from both participants. She found herself talking about things she had never spoken aloud, about Michael's death, about her decision to isolate herself in the mountains, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Bantu listened to it all, her intelligent eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When Sarah's voice cracked with emotion, Bantu would make soft grunting sounds, not threatening but almost comforting, as if she understood that this human was sharing something important. By dawn, both woman and gorilla were exhausted. Sarah had managed to clean and bandage Bantu's wound and had even convinced her to take some pain medication mixed with fruit from Sarah's emergency stores. Bantu had settled into a nest-like arrangement in the corner, using blankets that Sarah had provided. As the first light of morning filtered through the cabin windows, Sarah found herself studying her unlikely houseguest. Bantu was sleeping fitfully, occasionally making soft sounds that reminded Sarah of a child having bad dreams. Her massive hands, capable of incredible violence, were curled peacefully against her chest. Her face, so alien and yet so familiar, was relaxed in sleep. Sarah realized that somewhere in the course of that long night, something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone. For the first time since Michael's death, she had something to care about besides her own pain. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unprecedented in the annals of wildlife research. She had no idea that this was just the beginning. The next 5 days passed like a fever dream. Sarah found herself living with a creature that shouldn't exist in her world. A wild mountain gorilla who seemed to understand that the small cabin represented safety, warmth, and something she had never experienced before, interspecies friendship. Bantu proved to be a remarkably considerate house guest. Despite her size, she moved carefully around Sarah's belongings, never knocking over equipment or damaging anything important. She seemed to understand the cabin's rhythms when Sarah was working, when she needed space, when she was available for interaction. More importantly, Bantu began to heal. The wound on her shoulder, while still serious, was no longer bleeding. Sarah changed the bandages twice daily, a routine that Bantu not only tolerated, but seemed to anticipate. She would position herself in the best light, extend her injured arm, and remain perfectly still while Sarah worked. But it was the moments between medical care that truly amazed Sarah. Bantu was intensely curious about human behavior and technology. She would watch Sarah prepare meals, tilt her head when Sarah spoke on the satellite phone, and even appear to study Sarah's research notes when they were spread out on the table. On the third day, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about gorilla intelligence. While reviewing footage from her trail cameras, she found something impossible: video of Bantu from 2 weeks earlier, clearly showing her observing Sarah's research activities from a distance. Bantu hadn't stumbled upon Sarah's cabin by accident. She had been watching, learning, studying the human who studied her kind. When she was injured and desperate, she had made a calculated decision to seek help from the one human she had observed, showing respect and care for gorillas. "You've been planning this," Sarah said, looking at Bantu with new understanding. "Haven't you?" Bantu's response was a soft grunt that Sarah had learned to interpret as acknowledgement. Over the past few days, they had developed a basic communication system, not language exactly, but a series of sounds and gestures that allowed them to express basic needs and emotions. But communication was only the beginning of their developing relationship. Sarah began to notice that Bantu was exhibiting behaviors that were unprecedented in wild gorilla research. When Sarah appeared stressed or sad, Bantu would move closer, sometimes even making gentle physical contact. A massive hand placed carefully on Sarah's shoulder, a soft grunt of what sounded like sympathy. Most remarkably, Bantu began to participate in Sarah's research. When Sarah was reviewing photographs of local gorilla families, Bantu would react with obvious recognition, making specific sounds when she saw individuals she knew. She seemed to understand that Sarah was studying her species and appeared eager to help. On the 5th day, everything changed. Sarah was outside the cabin, checking her weather monitoring equipment, when she heard the sound that had haunted her nightmares for weeks. Human voices approaching through the forest. Male voices, speaking in a mixture of French and local dialect. And they were getting closer. Sarah's blood ran cold as she caught fragments of conversation. These were the poachers she had heard about on the radio. They were tracking something or someone, and they were heading directly toward her cabin. She rushed inside to find Bantu already alert, her massive frame tense with anxiety. Somehow, she had sensed the approaching danger before Sarah did. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Sarah understood that everything they had built together over the past 5 days was about to be tested. The poachers were looking for Bantu. The wound on her shoulder hadn't been random. It was from her escape from these very men. They had probably been tracking her for days, following her blood trail through the forest. And now they were about to discover that their prey had found sanctuary with the one person in these mountains who would fight to protect her. "We have to go," Sarah whispered, already moving toward her emergency pack. Right now, Bantu understood immediately. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her body language radiating tension and fear. The voices were getting closer, maybe 100 yards away now, maybe less. Sarah grabbed her essentials, water, food, medical supplies, and her satellite phone. She left everything else, her research, her equipment, 2 years of work, because none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting Bantu to safety and staying alive long enough to figure out their next move. But as they prepared to leave through the back door, Sarah heard something that made her freeze, the distinctive sound of automatic weapons being loaded and readied. These weren't just poachers hunting for gorilla trophies. These were military-grade weapons, carried by men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. Sarah looked at Bantu and saw her own fear reflected in those intelligent eyes. They were trapped. The poachers were too close to the cabin for them to escape undetected. In minutes, armed killers would be at Sarah's door, and she would have to make a choice that would determine whether she and Bantu lived or died. Outside, the voices grew louder. Inside, woman and gorilla prepared for a fight. Neither of them was sure they could win. The voices outside grew clearer as they approached, and Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the language patterns. These weren't random poachers. They were speaking in the distinctive dialect of a militant group that had been terrorizing the region for months. The same group responsible for the deaths of 3 park rangers just weeks earlier. Sarah moved to her rifle, but Bantu suddenly grabbed her arm with surprising gentleness. The gorilla's eyes were intense, focused, and she was making soft clicking sounds that Sarah had never heard before. Then, to Sarah's amazement, Bantu moved to the back door and gestured for Sarah to follow. But instead of heading toward the forest as Sarah expected, Bantu led her around the side of the cabin to a spot Sarah knew well, the entrance to a cave system that extended deep into the mountain. Sarah had explored these caves during her first months in the area, but had marked them off limits due to their instability. The rock formations were ancient and unpredictable, prone to sudden collapses that could trap or kill anyone foolish enough to venture too deep. Now, as armed killers approached her cabin, those same dangerous caves represented their only hope for survival. Bantu seemed to know exactly where she was going. She led Sarah through a narrow opening that was barely visible from the outside, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vegetation. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber, naturally lit by a shaft of sunlight from above. But what Sarah saw there made her gasp. This wasn't just a cave. It was a gorilla sanctuary. The chamber was filled with evidence of gorilla habitation, sleeping nests, food storage areas, and crude tools made from modified branches and stones. But more than that, it was clear that this space had been deliberately prepared for human guests. There were flat rocks arranged like furniture, a natural spring providing fresh water, and even what appeared to be a crude medical station with plants that Sarah recognized as traditional healing herbs. "You planned this," Sarah whispered, staring at Bantu in amazement. "All of it. The visit to my cabin, the trust building. You were preparing for this moment." Bantu's response was a complex series of gestures that Sarah was beginning to understand. She was communicating not just immediate intentions, but complex ideas about safety, planning, and cooperation. This gorilla wasn't just intelligent, she was strategic. Outside, they could hear the poachers reaching Sarah's cabin. Shouts of anger and frustration as they discovered the empty interior. The sound of equipment being smashed, personal belongings destroyed. Sarah had to fight the urge to look back, to mourn the loss of 2 years of research and the only home she had known since Michael's death. But as they settled into the hidden chamber, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the situation. In one corner of the cave, partially hidden behind a natural rock formation, she found something that made her blood freeze, a small pile of human belongings. A backpack, a water bottle, and a ranger's uniform with a name tag that read J. Mukamana. Sarah recognized the name immediately. Joseph Mukamana was one of the park rangers who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier, presumed dead after an encounter with poachers. But here was his equipment, carefully preserved and hidden in this cave. Bantu noticed Sarah's discovery and moved toward the pile of belongings. Her behavior became different, more solemn, almost reverent. She made soft sounds that Sarah had learned to associate with grief or loss. Then, with careful deliberation, Bantu picked up the ranger's water bottle and handed it to Sarah. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Bantu hadn't just observed Sarah's research activities. She had witnessed the killing of Ranger Mukamana. She had probably tried to help him, just as she was now trying to help Sarah. And when she couldn't save him, she had preserved his belongings as a form of memorial. But there was more. As Sarah examined the ranger's equipment more closely, she found something that changed their entire situation. A detailed map of the poacher network operating in the region, complete with routes, safe houses, and weapon caches. Mukamana had been conducting his own investigation into the militant group, and his research was far more comprehensive than anything the official authorities had compiled. Sarah studied the map by the dim light filtering through the cave opening. According to Mukamana's notes, the group currently hunting them was part of a larger operation involving ivory smuggling, illegal mining, and guerrilla trafficking. But more importantly, his map showed something else. A way out. There was a route through the cave system that emerged on the other side of the mountain, far from the poacher's current position. It was dangerous. Several passages were marked with warnings about instability and flooding risks, but it was possible. More than possible, it was their only chance. Sarah looked at Bantu and realized that the gorilla had been trying to tell her this all along. The cave wasn't just a hiding place, it was an escape route. Bantu had learned it from Ranger Mukamana before his death, and now she was passing that knowledge on to Sarah. Outside, the sounds of searching continued. The poachers were expanding their perimeter, looking for tracks, trying to determine which direction their prey had gone. Sarah knew they had maybe an hour before the search reached the cave system. After that, discovery was inevitable. She folded Mukamana's map and tucked it into her pack alongside his water bottle, a memorial she would carry for the man who had died trying to protect the same creatures she now fought to save. "Are you ready?" she asked Bantu, knowing the gorilla couldn't understand her words, but hoping she would understand the intent. Bantu's response was to move toward the deeper passages of the cave system, pausing only to look back and ensure Sarah was following. Together, they began a journey through underground passages that would either lead them to safety or become their tomb. Behind them, the sounds of the search grew more intense. Ahead of them lay darkness, uncertainty, and the slim hope that Ranger Mukamana's final gift would be enough to save their lives. The cave system was a labyrinth of narrow passages, underground rivers, and chambers that opened into cathedral-like spaces before narrowing again to tunnels barely wide enough for a human, let alone a 300-pound gorilla. But Bantu navigated through the darkness with confidence, her massive hands feeling along the walls, her acute senses guiding them through passages that Sarah never would have found on her own. For the first hour, they moved in relative silence, the only sounds their breathing and the soft padding of their feet on stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of water flow. Sarah followed Mukamana's map as best she could, but in the darkness, with only her small flashlight to guide them, navigation became a matter of trust. Trust in Bantu's knowledge of these passages, trust in a dead ranger's cartographic skills, and trust that they were moving towards safety rather than deeper into a trap. The first real challenge came when they reached what Mukamana had marked on his map as the Narrows, a passage so tight that Sarah had to remove her backpack and push it ahead of her, crawling on her belly through a tunnel that seemed to grow smaller with every foot of progress. Behind her, she could hear Bantu's labored breathing as the gorilla forced her massive frame through spaces barely large enough to accommodate her. At one point, Bantu became stuck. Sarah heard the gorilla's breathing change to something approaching: panic. And when she looked back with her flashlight, she could see that Bantu's shoulders were wedged against the tunnel walls. For several terrifying minutes, Sarah thought they would have to go back, but going back meant certain capture by the poachers, who were undoubtedly still searching for them. "Easy," Sarah whispered, crawling back toward Bantu. "Let me help." Working together, they managed to free Bantu by having her exhale completely and turn her body at a slight angle. It was a process that took nearly 20 minutes and left both of them exhausted. But they emerged from the Narrows into a larger chamber where they could finally stand upright. It was here that they encountered the second major obstacle: water. The chamber opened onto an underground river that was running higher and faster than Mukamana's map had indicated. The passage they needed to follow continued on the other side of the rushing water, but the current was strong enough to be dangerous even for experienced swimmers. For a gorilla who instinctively feared deep water, it represented a nearly insurmountable barrier. Sarah studied the situation by flashlight, looking for alternatives. The river was about 30 feet wide at this point, with rocky walls on both sides that offered no obvious crossing points. But then she noticed something that Mukamana had marked on his map: emergency rope. West wall, 4 feet up. Sure enough, hidden behind a rocky outcropping, Sarah found a climbing rope that the ranger had placed there during his own exploration of the cave system. It was old and showed signs of wear, but it seemed solid enough to support their weight if they were careful. Sarah tested the rope, then looked at Bantu. The gorilla was staring at the rushing water with obvious fear, making soft whimpering sounds that Sarah had never heard before. Gorillas were not natural swimmers, and everything in Bantu's instincts was telling her to avoid the water. But they had no choice. Behind them, Sarah could hear echoing sounds that suggested their pursuers were entering the cave system. They had perhaps 30 minutes before discovery became inevitable. "I'll go first," Sarah told Bantu, knowing the gorilla couldn't understand her words, but hoping her actions would communicate her intentions. "Then I'll help you across." The crossing was harrowing. The rope held, but the current was stronger than Sarah had anticipated, and by the time she reached the other side, her arms were shaking with exhaustion. But now came the real challenge: convincing a terrified gorilla to trust her life to a rope. over rushing water. Sarah called to Bantu from the other side, making the soft clicking sounds she had learned were comforting to the gorilla. But Bantu remained at the water's edge, clearly torn between her fear of the water and her trust in Sarah. Then, echoing through the cave system behind them, came the sound Sarah had been dreading. Human voices, much closer now, accompanied by the beams of powerful flashlights probing the darkness. Bantu heard them too. She looked back toward the sound of approaching danger, then forward at the water that terrified her. In that moment, Sarah saw something extraordinary happen. She watched as Bantu made a conscious choice to overcome her deepest instinctual fear in order to survive. The gorilla grabbed the rope. What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Bantu, despite her terror of deep water, began to cross the underground river hand over hand, her massive body swinging precariously over the rushing current. Her technique was awkward. Gorillas weren't built for rope climbing, but her strength was incredible, and her determination was absolute. Halfway across, disaster struck. The old rope, stressed beyond its limits by Bantu's 300-pound weight, began to fray. Sarah could see individual strands snapping in the beam of her flashlight, and she realized they had seconds before complete failure. "Faster!" Sarah shouted, knowing Bantu couldn't understand English, but hoping her tone would communicate the urgency. Bantu seemed to sense the rope's weakness. She increased her pace, but her movement caused the rope to swing more violently, putting even greater stress on the failing anchor points. Just as she reached the 3/4 mark, the rope snapped. But instead of falling into the rushing water, Bantu made a leap that defied everything Sarah knew about gorilla physical capabilities. She launched herself toward the rocky bank where Sarah waited, covering the remaining distance in a single, desperate bound that brought her crashing down on solid ground with an impact that echoed through the chamber. They had no time to celebrate. The voices behind them were much closer now, and Sarah could see the reflection of flashlight beams on the wet cave walls. Their pursuers had reached the underground river and would soon discover the broken rope. Sarah and Bantu ran deeper into the cave system, following Mukamana's map through passages that grew increasingly treacherous. They navigated across narrow ledges with 100-foot drops, squeezed through cracks in the rock that seemed impossible for Bantu's massive frame, and stumbled through chambers filled with loose stones that threatened to cause avalanches with every step. Behind them, their pursuers were gaining ground. The poachers had better equipment, more powerful lights, and the advantage of not caring about the cave's structural integrity. Sarah could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search, closing the distance between hunter and prey. It was in one of the deepest chambers, nearly 3 miles from the cave entrance, that Sarah made a terrible discovery. According to Mukamana's map, they had reached the point where the cave system was supposed to emerge onto the other side of the mountain. But instead of an exit, they found a wall of rock where the passage had collapsed, probably years earlier. They were trapped. Sarah stared at the rockfall in despair, her flashlight illuminating tons of fallen stone that would take heavy equipment to clear. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers echoed through the tunnels, no more than 10 minutes away now. But Bantu wasn't giving up. The gorilla moved along the wall of fallen rock, her hands exploring the gaps between stones, her acute senses searching for something Sarah couldn't perceive. Then, in a crack so narrow that Sarah had missed it completely, Bantu found what they were looking for: moving air. There was space behind the rockfall. Not much, but possibly enough for them to squeeze through. Working together with desperate efficiency, they began to move rocks, creating a gap just wide enough for human passage. For Bantu, it would be nearly impossible, but the alternative was capture or death. As the voices of their pursuers grew closer, echoing off the cave walls like the sounds of approaching demons, Bantu made another impossible choice. She insisted that Sarah go first. Using gestures and the soft grunting sounds that had become their shared language, Bantu made it clear that Sarah should enter the gap immediately. When Sarah hesitated, unwilling to abandon her friend, Bantu became more insistent, physically, pushing Sarah toward the opening with surprising gentleness. "I'm not leaving you," Sarah whispered. But even as she spoke, she could see the logic in Bantu's position. If Sarah went first and the passage was clear, she could help Bantu from the other side. If she went first and the passage was blocked, she could come back and they could find another solution together. Sarah squeezed through the gap, emerging into a chamber on the other side of the rock fall. Her flashlight revealed another passage continuing deeper into the mountain, but more importantly, she could feel moving air that suggested an eventual exit to the surface. She turned back to help Bantu through the gap, but what she saw made her heart stop. Flashlight beams were illuminating the chamber where Bantu waited, and she could hear voices much closer than before. Their pursuers had found them. "Move!" Sarah shouted through the gap, but Bantu was already in motion, forcing her massive body through an opening that seemed physically impossible to navigate. The sound of automatic weapons being readied echoed through the chamber as Bantu squeezed through the gap with inches to spare. On the other side, Sarah grabbed the gorilla's hands and pulled with all her strength, helping to drag her through just as the first shots rang out behind them. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, filling the air with deadly fragments of stone and metal. But Sarah and Bantu were already running deeper into the mountain, following a passage that led upward toward what they hoped would be their salvation. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers trying to follow through the gap they had created. But the opening was too small for men carrying military equipment. There were shouts of frustration, more gunfire, and the sound of rocks being moved as the poachers tried to widen the passage. Sarah and Bantu had gained precious time, but they both knew it wouldn't last long. Their pursuers would eventually break through, and when they did, the chase would resume with even greater intensity. As they climbed through passages that grew steeper and more treacherous with each step, Sarah realized they were racing against more than just the poachers behind them. The sound of shifting rocks, the occasional groan of stressed stone, and the increasing instability of the cave. Walls all suggested that their passage through the system was causing structural damage that could result in a catastrophic collapse. They were running through a mountain that was slowly coming apart around them, pursued by killers who would rather see them buried alive than escape to tell their story. The only way out was up, through passages that grew more dangerous with every step, toward a surface exit that might not even exist anymore. After what felt like hours of climbing through increasingly narrow passages, Sarah and Bantu finally saw it, a faint shaft of natural light filtering down from above. The exit was real, but it was nearly straight up, a natural chimney in the rock that would require technical climbing skills to navigate safely. Sarah studied the ascent by flashlight. The chimney was about 40 feet high, with enough hand and footholds to make the climb possible, but it would be challenging even for an experienced climber. For a gorilla, it would be nearly impossible. But as Sarah contemplated their options, she heard something that made the decision for them. The sound of their pursuers breaking through the rock fall behind them. Shouts of triumph, followed by the beam of powerful flashlights probing the passage they had just traveled. They had minutes, maybe less, before the poachers reached their position. "Can you climb?" Sarah asked Bantu, knowing the gorilla couldn't understand the words, but hoping her gestures would communicate the question. Bantu studied the chimney, then looked back toward the approaching lights. Her response was to begin climbing immediately, her powerful arms finding purchase on rock ledges that would have been impossible for Sarah to use. Sarah followed, grateful for her rock climbing experience, but amazed by Bantu's natural ability. The gorilla climbed with an efficiency and confidence that made the ascent look easy, despite the obvious strain it placed on her injured shoulder. They were halfway to the surface when the first poacher reached the bottom of the chimney. Sarah looked down to see a man with an assault rifle studying their escape route, speaking rapidly into a radio headset. The man raised his weapon and fired. The sound of automatic gunfire in the confined space was deafening, and rock chips exploded around Sarah and Bantu as bullets ricocheted off the stone walls. But the angle was wrong for accurate shooting, and most of the shots went wide, Sarah climbed faster, her hands bleeding from sharp rock edges, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. Above her, Bantu had reached a ledge about 10 feet from the surface and was looking down with obvious concern for Sarah's progress. More shots echoed up from below, followed by the sound of the gunman beginning his own ascent. Sarah realized with horrible clarity that they weren't going to make it. The poacher was climbing faster than she could, and he would reach shooting range before they could escape to the surface. But then Bantu did something that would become legend in Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. The gorilla, who could have easily escaped through the surface opening, instead moved back down towards Sarah, positioning herself between the climbing poacher and the woman she had chosen to protect. When the gunman reached a position where he could take accurate aim at Sarah, Bantu was ready. With a roar that echoed through the chimney like thunder, she launched herself downward in a controlled fall that brought her massive weight crashing into the poacher just as he squeezed the trigger. The collision was devastating. Both Bantu and the gunman tumbled down the chimney in a tangle of limbs and equipment, crashing into the rocks below with an impact that Sarah felt through the stone walls around her. For several terrifying seconds, the chimney was filled with the sounds of struggle. Grunts, shouts, the clatter of weapons hitting stone. Then suddenly, silence. Sarah looked down and saw Bantu climbing back up toward her, moving more slowly now, but apparently uninjured. At the bottom of the chimney, the poacher lay motionless among the rocks, his weapon shattered, his radio destroyed. But there were others. Sarah could hear voices and see lights in the passage below, and she knew more poachers were coming. The confrontation had bought them time, but not safety. Together, Sarah and Bantu completed their climb to the surface, emerging into a dawn landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. They were on the far side of the mountain from Sarah's cabin, in territory that was unfamiliar but free from immediate pursuit. The surface opening was well hidden among rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation, which explained why their pursuers hadn't found it from above. But Sarah knew their escape was temporary. The poachers would eventually find other ways to this side of the mountain, and when they did, the hunt would resume. As she and Bantu caught their breath in the early morning sunlight, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of their relationship. They couldn't run forever. They couldn't hide indefinitely. If they were going to survive, they needed to stop being prey and start fighting back. She pulled out Ranger Mukamana's map and studied it in the growing light. According to his notes, there was a ranger station about 15 miles northeast of their current position. If they could reach it, they could get help, report the poacher network, and ensure that Mukamana's final investigation wasn't in vain. But 15 miles through hostile territory, with armed killers hunting them, would require more than luck and determination. It would require the kind of partnership between species that had never been documented in wildlife research. Sarah looked at Bantu, who was studying the landscape with the same tactical awareness she had shown throughout their underground journey. The gorilla seemed to understand that their escape was just the beginning of a larger challenge. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, knowing that Bantu couldn't understand her words, but confident that she would understand the intent. Bantu's response was to move toward the tree line, pausing only to look back and ensure Sarah was following. Together, they began the journey that would either establish them as one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of human-animal relationships, or cost them their lives. Behind them, echoing up from the cave system, came the sound of more poachers beginning their ascent toward the surface. The chase was far from over. The 15-mile journey to the ranger station became an odyssey that tested every survival skill Sarah had learned during her 2 years in the mountains. But more than that, it became a masterclass in interspecies cooperation that challenged everything the scientific community thought it knew about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. Bantu proved to be not just a companion, but a guide whose knowledge of the local terrain was encyclopedic. She knew which water sources were safe to drink from, which plants were edible, and which paths through the forest would avoid both predators and human threats. More remarkably, She seemed to understand their strategic situation and actively contributed to their tactical decisions. When they needed to cross open areas where they might be spotted by aircraft or ground patrols, Bantu would scout ahead, using her superior senses to detect threats before they became dangerous. When they needed to rest, she would choose locations that offered both concealment and multiple escape routes. When they needed to move quickly, she would clear obstacles from their path and help Sarah navigate difficult terrain. But it was the emotional support that Bantu provided that truly amazed Sarah. During the most challenging moments of their journey, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, when the sounds of pursuit seemed to be getting closer, when despair crept in and made Sarah question whether they would survive, Bantu would provide comfort in ways that seemed almost human in their sophistication. She would share her food when Sarah was hungry, create windbreaks with her body when Sarah was cold, and provide silent companionship when Sarah needed to process the trauma of everything they had experienced together. Most remarkably, she seemed to sense when Sarah was thinking about Michael, and during these moments of grief, Bantu would make soft sounds that were unmistakably comforting. On the second day of their journey, they encountered their first major challenge. A river crossing that was too wide and too fast for them to navigate safely on their own. The bridge that Mukamana's map indicated should be there had been destroyed, probably by the same militant group that was hunting them. Sarah studied the situation, looking for alternatives, but the river was at least 100 yards wide at this point, with a current strong enough to sweep away even strong swimmers. On the other side, she could see the ranger station in the distance, so close and yet impossibly far away. But Bantu had a different perspective on the problem. She studied the riverbank carefully, then began gathering fallen logs and branches, arranging them in a way that initially seemed random to Sarah. But as the guerrillas' work progressed, Sarah began to understand what she was seeing. Bantu was building a raft. The construction process was remarkable to observe. Bantu used her incredible strength to position logs in precise arrangements, then used vines and flexible branches to lash them together with knots that, while crude, were unmistakably functional. She had somehow learned engineering principles through observation and was applying them to solve a complex problem. Working together, they completed the raft in about 4 hours. It wasn't pretty, but it was seaworthy, and more importantly, it was large enough to support both of them. As they prepared to launch their improvised vessel, Sarah realized she was witnessing something that would revolutionize understanding of great ape intelligence. The river crossing was harrowing, their raft held together, but controlling its direction. In the current, required constant effort from both passengers. Sarah used a long branch as a paddle, while Bantu provided stability and power, her massive hands gripping the log frame to keep them from capsizing. Halfway across, they encountered rapids that nearly destroyed their raft and would have killed them both, if not for Bantu's quick thinking. When the current threatened to drive them into a cluster of rocks that would have shattered their vessel, Bantu abandoned her position on the raft and entered the water, using her body as a living anchor to guide them safely through the dangerous passage. By the time they reached the other side, both were exhausted and hypothermic, but they were alive and within sight of their goal. The ranger station was less than a mile away, and Sarah could see smoke rising from its chimney, a sign that it was occupied and operational. But their relief was short-lived. As they approached the station through the forest, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction they had come. Their pursuers had given up the ground chase and called in air support. The helicopter was flying a search pattern, and it was only a matter of minutes before it would spot them in the open area around the ranger station. Sarah and Bantu were caught between the safety they had fought so hard to reach and the aerial hunters who would kill them both rather than let them report what they had witnessed. With less than half a mile to go, they faced their final and most dangerous challenge. The helicopter was getting closer, its rotors creating a sound that seemed to fill the entire forest. Sarah could see rangers emerging from the station, alerted by the approaching aircraft. But she could also see that these weren't the friendly faces she had hoped to find. The men coming out of the ranger station were armed with the same military-grade weapons carried by the poachers who had been hunting them. The station had been compromised, taken over by the same militant group they had been fleeing from for 3 days. They had run 15 miles through some of the most dangerous terrain in Central Africa, only to discover that their destination was controlled by their enemies. The trap was perfect, and there was nowhere left to run. Sarah looked at Bantu and saw her own desperation reflected in the gorilla's intelligent eyes. They had come so far, survived so much, built something unprecedented between their species, and now it was all going to end in a ranger station parking lot, with their bodies left as a warning to anyone else who might interfere with the poacher network. But Bantu wasn't giving up. Even as the helicopter approached and armed men emerged from the station, she was studying their surroundings, looking for options that Sarah couldn't see. And in her eyes, Sarah saw something that gave her hope. The same strategic intelligence that had gotten them this far was still working, still planning, still fighting for their survival. The final confrontation was about to begin. What happened next would be debated by wildlife experts, military analysts, and behavioral psychologists for decades to come. As the helicopter circled overhead and armed men advanced from the compromised ranger station, Bantu made a decision that defied every assumption about guerrilla behavior and intelligence. She began to call. The sound that emerged from Bantu's massive chest was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard before. It wasn't the typical guerrilla vocalization she knew from her research. This was something deeper, more complex, almost musical in its structure. It carried through the forest with remarkable clarity, echoing off the mountainsides and reverberating through the valleys below. And from the forest around them, other voices began to answer. Sarah watched in amazement as the sound of approaching gorillas filled the air. Not just one or two individuals, but what sounded like entire family groups responding to Bantu's call. The forest itself seemed to be awakening, with the voices of mountain gorillas creating a symphony of communication that Sarah had never imagined possible. The men from the ranger station stopped their advance, clearly confused by the unexpected chorus emerging from the surrounding jungle. Even the helicopter pilot seemed unsure how to respond, the aircraft hovering uncertainly as the forest erupted with the sounds of responding gorillas. But Sarah understood what was happening. During her 2 years of research, she had observed guerrilla family groups coordinating complex activities, but she had never seen anything like this. Bantu wasn't just calling for help. She was organizing a response that involved multiple family groups across a wide geographical area. The first gorillas to emerge from the forest were massive silverback males, their silver-backed forms materializing from the undergrowth like ancient guardians responding to a call to arms. Behind them came females with young adolescents and juvenile gorillas, entire family structures moving with purpose and coordination toward the ranger station. The armed men at the station began to panic. Their weapons were designed for hunting individual animals or intimidating humans, but they found themselves facing a coordinated response from dozens of mountain gorillas acting with apparent tactical awareness. The helicopter pilot, faced with a situation unlike anything in his training, made the decision to land rather than risk flying over what had become a guerrilla assembly zone. As the aircraft settled onto the ground near the station, Sarah realized that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. But the most remarkable moment came when Bantu began to move toward the station. Not in aggression, but in what appeared to be a diplomatic approach. She walked upright, her massive hands visible and empty, her posture communicating peaceful intentions, while the sheer presence of her supporters made any hostile action inadvisable. Sarah followed, staying close to Bantu, but allowing the gorilla to lead what had become an unprecedented interspecies negotiation. As they approached the armed men, Sarah could see fear and confusion in their faces. These were killers who had terrorized the region for months, but they had never encountered organized resistance from the very animals they hunted. The standoff that followed lasted nearly 20 minutes. The guerrillas maintained their positions around the station, while the armed men stood frozen, unwilling to provoke a confrontation they clearly didn't understand. The helicopter pilot remained in his cockpit, his engine running, but his aircraft surrounded by what appeared to be a guerrilla security perimeter. It was during this tense standoff that Sarah heard the sound that changed everything. The distinctive whine of approaching military jets. Real military jets, not the cobbled-together aircraft used by militant groups. Someone had called in legitimate government forces. The jets passed overhead in formation, followed by the heavy sound of military transport helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Within minutes, the area around the Ranger station was surrounded by legitimate military forces who had been tracking the militant group for weeks as government. Soldiers secured the area and arrested the militants who had taken over the station. Sarah found herself at the center of an intelligence briefing that would reshape understanding of the poacher networks operating in the region. Ranger Mukamana's map and documentation, which she had carried through their entire ordeal, provided evidence that allowed authorities to dismantle an operation that had been responsible for the deaths of dozens of park rangers and the illegal killing of hundreds of mountain gorillas. But it was Bantu's role in their rescue that truly amazed the military commanders. Through careful questioning and observation, they began to understand that the guerrilla had somehow coordinated a response involving multiple family groups across several square miles of territory. She had not only saved Sarah's life, but had organized the first documented case of intergroup guerrilla cooperation in response to a human threat. As the area was secured and the immediate danger passed, Sarah found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her. Career and her relationship with Bantu. Government wildlife officials were insisting that Bantu be captured and relocated to a secure facility for study, not as punishment, but as protection for an animal who had demonstrated unprecedented intelligence and strategic thinking. But Sarah knew that captivity, however well-intentioned, would destroy everything that made Bantu unique. The gorilla's intelligence had been shaped by her freedom, her connections to wild family groups, and her ability to navigate the complex social and environmental challenges of mountain life. The decision Sarah made next would determine not only Bantu's future, but the future of human gorilla research and the conservation efforts that were fighting to save the mountain gorillas from extinction. Standing in the cleared area around the ranger station, surrounded by military personnel and wildlife officials, with Bantu watching from the forest edge where she had retreated when the government forces arrived, Sarah prepared to make an argument that would either revolutionize wildlife research or end her career forever. She stays free. Those 3 words, spoken by Sarah to a circle of government officials, wildlife experts, and military commanders, would echo through the scientific community for years to come. But in that moment, standing in a forest clearing, with the greatest partnership in her life hanging in the balance, Sarah Chen was simply a woman fighting for her friend. The debate that followed was intense. Wildlife officials argued about precedent, about research opportunities, about the unprecedented nature of Bantu's demonstrated abilities. Military commanders focused on security implications. What if other guerrilla groups could be organized in similar ways? What did this mean for regional stability? But Sarah's argument was simple and powerful. Bantu's intelligence hadn't developed in isolation. It was the product of her relationships with wild guerrilla communities, her freedom to navigate complex social and environmental challenges, and her ability to make choices that weren't predetermined by human handlers. Captivity, however comfortable, would diminish the very qualities that made her remarkable. More importantly, Sarah argued, Bantu had earned the right to choose her own fate. She had saved human lives, exposed a criminal network, and demonstrated cognitive abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness. She deserved to be treated as a partner, not a specimen. The decision reached by the assembled officials was unprecedented. Bantu would remain free, but would become the subject of the most comprehensive wild gorilla research project in history. Sarah would return to the mountains, not as an isolated researcher, but as the leader of an international team studying what had already become known as the Bantu Protocol, the first documented case of strategic interspecies cooperation between humans and great apes. As the officials departed and the area around the ranger station returned to quiet, Sarah found herself alone with Bantu for the first time since their ordeal began. The gorilla approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, until they were facing each other, just as they had on that first night when Bantu appeared at Sarah's cabin door. But everything had changed. Sarah was no longer a grieving woman hiding from the world, and Bantu was no longer just a wounded animal seeking help. They had become something new together, partners who had faced death, built trust across species boundaries, and created a bond that would reshape both their lives. Bantu reached out her massive hand, not in request for help this time, but in what appeared to be a gesture of farewell. Sarah took the offered hand, feeling the incredible gentleness with which this powerful creature could express affection. "I'll be back," Sarah whispered, knowing that Bantu couldn't understand the words, but hoping she would understand the promise behind them. "This isn't goodbye. This is just the beginning." Bantu's response was a soft grunt that Sarah had learned to interpret as acknowledgement and approval. Then, with a grace that still amazed Sarah after everything they had shared, Bantu turned and walked back toward the forest where her family groups were waiting. But she paused at the tree line, looked back one more time, and made a sound that Sarah recognized as the same welcoming call she had used to organize the rescue at the ranger station. It was an invitation, not just to Sarah, but to anyone willing to approach the natural world with respect, curiosity, and open hearts. 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen returned to the Virunga Mountains as the director of the International Mountain Gorilla Intelligence Project. Her team included primatologists, cognitive scientists, and behavioral researchers from 12 countries, all working together to understand the implications of what had happened between a grieving woman and a wounded gorilla. Bantu became the first wild gorilla to be recognized as a research partner rather than a research subject. She participated in studies, demonstrated problem-solving abilities that revolutionized understanding of great ape cognition, and continued to coordinate activities between previously isolated gorilla family groups. But more than that, she became a symbol of what was possible when humans approached the natural world not as conquerors or even as protectors, but as partners in the complex web of intelligence and emotion that connects all living things. The research legacy that began with a knock on a cabin door in the middle of a frozen night continues today. Scientists around the world study the Bantu Protocol, looking for ways to build similar partnerships with other species. Conservation efforts have been revolutionized by understanding that protecting wildlife means respecting the intelligence and emotional complexity of the animals we share this planet with. And somewhere in the mountains of Central Africa, a woman and a gorilla continue their partnership, exploring the boundaries between species, challenging assumptions about consciousness and connection, and proving every day that the most important discoveries happen not in laboratories, but in the moments when we open our hearts to the possibility that we are not alone in our capacity to think, to feel, and to love. This story isn't just about Sarah and Bantu. It's about the connections that exist all around us, waiting to be recognized and respected. It's about the intelligence that exists in forms we're only beginning to understand. It's about the courage it takes to open our doors, literally and metaphorically, to the possibility that we might not be the only species capable of complex thought and deep emotion. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about the animals we share this world with, then I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for Wind Echo. Untold. Stories like this, real stories about the extraordinary, connections that exist in our natural world. These are the stories that matter most right now. And you being here, being part of this community, helps ensure that these stories get told. Second, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Share it with someone who loves animals, someone who's struggling with loneliness, someone who needs to be reminded that intelligence and love exist in forms we're only beginning to understand. Third, tell me in the comments, what did you learn from Sarah and Bantu's story? How has it changed the way you think about the animals in your own life? What connections have you experienced that challenged your assumptions about what it means to be human? Because here's the truth that Sarah and Bantu taught us. We are not alone on this planet. We are surrounded by intelligence, by emotion, by creatures capable of choice and sacrifice and love. The question is whether we're brave enough to open our doors when they knock. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for caring about these stories. And remember, the greatest discoveries happen when we approach the world not as conquerors, but as partners in the incredible adventure of consciousness itself. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your minds curious. The world is full of partners waiting to be discovered.